The spiral pit was neither a pit, nor particularly spiral. It was a colossal floating death disk orbiting the gravitational corpse of Vorax 9, a black hole so old it had a museum attached. The arena was a product of 17 species, 5 civil wars, and 1 interstellar compromise that began with a blood pact and ended in committee. Its purpose was simple: let rival empires solve diplomatic tensions by pointing shiny weapons at each other in front of an audience of billions. This year's spectacle promised more fireworks than usual. The Obsidian Fold had submitted their newest war construct, a living armor hybrid symbiote capable of vaporizing cities with the same casual malice one might apply to peeling fruit. The Grendelric Senate filed a formal complaint before the match even started, mostly because the Fold's entry was rumored to have consumed its pilot on the way to registration. And the humans. Well, the humans brought a crank. Not a metaphorical crank. A literal one. A hand-cranked, rotating barrel, belt-fed projectile thrower from their pre-fusion era. To the rest of the galaxy, it looked like a child's science fair gone rogue. Most dignitaries assumed it was a ceremonial offering. A prop. A joke. It had not occurred to anyone, except perhaps the humans themselves, that they intended to use it. Above the arena, twin announcer drones flitted in lazy figure-eights, broadcasting the event across every corner of galactic civilization. One of them, sleek and polished, spoke with the cultured, dispassionate voice of a being who'd spent too much time commentating over fireworks and war crimes. Welcome to the final match of the Unified Weapons Demonstration Trials. It began, its lens adjusting for dramatic effect. Today's event, Kinetic Legacy Systems versus High Evolution Warfare. Its counterpart, a rusted ex-military model missing half its casing, coughed static and added, in other words, a gun that spins versus a god that doesn't need to. The audience, an amorphous swirl of species, rituals, and scented atmospheric bubbles, howled in anticipatory bloodlust. On the west viewing bank, the gelatinous dignitaries of the Drellic Confederacy sprayed celebratory spore clouds into one another's respiratory membranes. A few rows down, a group of tentacled merchants passed around a commemorative program that labeled the human contestant as Intermittent Species Number 872, Comic Relief. The arena floor shifted, reconfiguring itself from a jagged crystalline wasteland into a more neutral battlefield. Gray stone, wide sightlines, gentle inclines designed to accommodate both hover-based and footed species. The walls pulsed with calming colors meant to ease interspecies anxiety. This had no visible effect on the cheering crowds, several of whom had already begun devouring the ceremonial flags of their rivals. Down in the launch corridor, beneath the screams and seismic light shows, Ellie Mira Trask was checking the sights on a gun older than galactic bureaucracy. The crank stuck. She jiggled it. It unstuck. Well, said the voice in her skull, at least it's honest. Ellie grunted. She didn't speak often, and when she did, it usually came out sounding like she'd already said it in her head and was annoyed to have to repeat it. The voice belonged to Maggie, her combat-grade neural interface, long since obsolete, questionably patched, and disturbingly fluent in sarcasm. It had been with Ellie through 2 planetary occupations, 6 bureaucratic misfires, and 1 unfortunate affair involving a wine-drunk diplomat and a badly timed detonation. Now, they were being wheeled out for galactic amusement. "Do we have a plan?" Maggie asked. "Shoot until things stop moving." "Oh, good. Simplicity. You know, most contestants bring plasma knives or anti-sentient drones. But no. You brought history on a tripod." Ellie checked the belt feed. 65 rounds of solid tungsten joy. She looked up as the corridor lights shifted from red to green, bathing her in the emerald glow of readiness. Her reflection in the blast door stared back with the same half-lidded disinterest she always wore before combat. A faint hiss. The door unsealed. Ellie stepped into sunlight. Above, the announcer's tone brightened. And now, the human entry, Ellie Mira Trask of Terran Designation 3, armed with an ancient Earth weapon colloquially known as the Gatling gun. The crowd laughed. Laughed. Not booed. Not jeered. They laughed, the sort of laugh that comes with watching someone try to arm wrestle a tidal wave. Even the screens displayed animated bananas slipping on bullets. Ellie stepped forward, expression unchanged. She wore mismatched armor, scavenged, scratched, scorched. Her boots were regulation only in that they existed. A ragged cloth had been tied around her arm, not as a badge, but as a reminder. No one ever asked what it meant. No one ever asked her much of anything. Across the field, the obsidian folds construct descended from a levitating dais made of something that looked like volcanic ivory and hummed in frequencies the human ear would call regretful. It landed without touching the ground. Commander Jkar of the fold stood 3 meters tall, composed of reactive plating, symbiotic tissue, and weapon systems grafted into bone. He radiated the smugness of someone whose personal body count was considered a regional holiday. He regarded Ellie as one might regard a beetle with a rock collection. Primitive, he said in high Foldic, the language of imperial sarcasm. Ellie cracked her neck. Jkar raised one massive claw, adorned with shifting sigils that translated roughly to, "I've already won." The betting boards updated in real time. Odds in Jkar's favor spiked to 20,000:1. A small notice appeared beneath Ellie's name, survival odds statistically negligible. Please gamble responsibly. A signal flare launched from the observation deck, splintering into thousands of floating symbols denoting unity and mutual respect through overwhelming force. The match began. Jkar moved first. Fast, silent, fluid. He glided forward in near silence, limbs extending, weapons unfolding. From his chest, a blistering ray of photonic distortion fired directly at Ellie. She rolled. The ground behind her cratered, stone melting into slag. Ellie came up on one knee, cranked the gun, and let it spin. The sound was alien to everyone present. A deep, mechanical chugging, clink-chuck-chuck-clink, that defied the fluid grace of modern weapons. A sound with weight, with muscle. A sound that meant something physical is coming your way and it has zero interest in politics. The gun fired. Not in bursts. In a stream. A river of metal. The projectiles weren't guided by AI or tricked out with microfission tips. They were bullets. Dumb, fast, heavy bullets. They struck Jkar's armor, and the armor responded as it had been taught, by absorbing energy. But this wasn't energy. This was momentum. The first volley staggered him. The second dented his left shoulder. The third punched through. The crowd went quiet. Ellie adjusted the crank speed, stepping sideways to avoid a retaliation strike. Sparks flew. She kept firing. Jkar tried to shield his vital nodes. One of his symbiotic implants screamed. Ellie didn't stop. Maggie hummed. "You're upsetting the sponsors." Jkar roared, spinning and launching a barrage of anti-personnel spores. Ellie ducked behind a broken support beam. The spores vaporized everything around her, except her gun. She emerged, coughing, one eye singed, and resumed the barrage. Jkar began to retreat. Someone in the crowd gasped. The announcers glitched. "Ladies and sentients, it appears the human is winning?" The Gatling gun whirred on. Shell casings littered the field. Smoke rose in angry tendrils. Ellie advanced with the slow certainty of someone moving through wet concrete, deliberate, inevitable. Jkar collapsed, his left leg severed, his weapon arm mangled, his armor weeping fluorescent pus. The gun slowed. The field stilled. Ellie walked past him without a glance. A drone drifted toward her, recording every second. She looked up at it. Spoke. Still funny. Then she walked off the field. The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't know how. Somewhere, in the upper diplomatic rings, a treaty was being quietly torn in half. On betting networks, a species-wide bankruptcy was declared. And in the memory cores of 17 military think tanks, the phrase Gatling gun was input as a red-level threat. The spiral pit remained silent. Only the discarded brass spoke. And it said, "You laughed. You shouldn't have." Ellie Mira Trask had been catalogued by 5 governments, 2 empires, and 1 malfunctioning survey drone as human, female, functional, unremarkable. The consensus, largely unspoken, was that she was one of those Earth creatures that blended quietly into the machinery of war and didn't cause trouble unless specifically asked. She was, in truth, a kind of problem no one had learned to define. Now, she stood in the armament chamber of the spiral pit, adjusting the crude iron receiver of a Gatling gun older than most planetary flags. Her armor, patched and scorched, was unbranded. Her boots clicked faintly on the steel floor, which trembled every time the Obsidian Folds champion above did something dramatic, such as exhale. "Still time to fake an aneurysm," said the voice in her skull. "Just fall over twitching. Classic Earth exit." Ellie didn't blink. Tempting. Maggie, officially M4G3, a semi-retired neural integration unit, had been running in Ellie's head for 23 years. Originally designed for threat assessment, it now spent its processor cycles quoting Terran music lyrics and attempting social commentary. It had once assisted in a planetary siege by impersonating a deity. Ellie had never forgiven it for that. "Honestly," Maggie continued, "it's not too late to swap this antique for a pulse array. Even a slingshot would be more photogenic." Ellie ran a cloth down the length of the gun barrel. "Not about photogenic." "No," Maggie agreed. "This is about vengeance." Ellie didn't answer. She tightened a strap across her shoulder and checked the weight distribution. Her movements were mechanical but careful, like someone handling glass inside a cyclone. She could feel the distant thrum of the crowd. Could smell the chemical vapor of charged air and ozone. The arena above was a theater of rituals and thunder, where species came to cheer at explosions and forget their trade disputes. She was not here to entertain. A screen flickered to life beside her. A wide-angle feed from the upper chambers showed the Obsidian Folds champion performing a traditional limb-stretching ceremony that involved flexing all 17 of its visible joints while a priestess coated it in oil that shrieked in 2 frequencies. Commander Chkar, as always, had flair. His armor was a woven exoskeleton of bone and synthetic obsidian, grown over 2 centuries from harvested battlefield remains. His weapon systems, symbiotic, integrated, semi-sentient, functioned as both muscle and mind, reacting to threats faster than conscious input. In the last demonstration match, he had reduced a Grom Battle Titan to mineral confetti before its pilot even located the manual override. Ellie squinted. The feed zoomed, focusing on the dorsal vent junction behind his primary neckplate. "Thermal overcompensation," she murmured. Maggie paused. "You're going to shoot him there?" "Eventually." "Good," said Maggie almost wistfully. "I'd hate to see you go back to therapy." The announcer's voice filtered through the metal walls, bombastic and filtered for multilingual translation. "And now, we prepare for the most anticipated mismatch of the cycle. On one side, the undefeated terror of the fold, the breaker of fleets, the annihilation engine of the East Spindle, Commander Chkar." Thunderous applause. Some species detonated small portions of themselves in celebratory ritual. One delegate fainted in admiration. Versus Earth's offering. Ellie Mira Trask, armed with a Gatling gun. There was a moment. A pause. As if the universe itself needed a second to make sure it had heard that correctly. Then came the laughter. It poured down the transmission waves in roaring tides, high-pitched chittering, ultrasonic tremors, one melodic fart loop that translated to mockery in 3 dialects. Entire viewerships tuned in just to witness the comedy of a Terran using analog weaponry in an age of matter-phase kinetics and psychic artillery. Ellie adjusted the feed belt. She wasn't insulted. She was calculating. Because laughter, in her experience, was a sound people made right before they stopped breathing. Across the hangar, a mechanic passed by, snorting. He glanced at her gear. "That thing even work?" he asked in perfect lingua pax. Ellie looked up, eyes dry and flat. "Does murder count as working?" The mechanic stumbled backward and didn't ask again. In the observation ring above, alien generals jostled politely for position near the viewglass. A few, knowing the betting markets, had already drafted press releases mocking human incompetence. The galaxy had long accepted Terrans as an amusing footnote, resourceful in a scavenger kind of way, stubborn, and culturally saturated with emotional damage. Their early wars had been terrifying, yes, but primitive. They'd traded nuclear winter for terraforming contracts. Now they made decent food, sang sad songs, and occasionally helped with insurgency cleanup. Their weapons were considered novelties, collectibles, obsolete. Chkar's herald floated into view, trailing banners of living silk and bioluminescent spores. It unfurled a massive scroll from its internal cavity and began to read in a voice that sounded like two stones arguing. Behold! The flame of fold, the ascendant jaw, the star-wound general. Ellie tuned it out. She watched Chkar himself. The commander's stance had shifted. Not defensive. Not aggressive. Performative. Good. He was still pretending. That meant he hadn't started thinking. Maggie hummed. You're hoping he gets sloppy. He already is. He's got 17 limbs. Exactly. Too many to cover at once. A new feed displayed betting odds. Human victory had been rated at 0.00008%. Several species had launched celebratory bets on how fast she'd explode. A gelatinous cartel was offering rewards for video snippets of her death to use in propaganda films. Maggie sighed theatrically. Galactic fame's a hell of a drug. Ellie checked the last belt of ammunition. Hand-forged. Packed with dense kinetic love and spite. Her fingertips brushed the side of the gun's crank. She remembered the field tests in Montana. The field commander's sneer. The way the recoil buckled structures not meant for sudden honesty. She had liked the recoil. The room vibrated again. A signal pulse. The match was minutes away. A new broadcast began, a pre-fight commentary show with two floating blobs engaged in poorly translated sarcasm. Do you believe the human will last longer than 10 seconds? Oh, I hope not. The last match was so dull. Indeed. You'd think Earth would at least send someone with an electric weapon. Maybe next time they'll bring a boomerang. Ellie listened. Not because it offended her. Because it was data. They expected a joke. A desperate flailing. A futile charge with mechanical noise. They didn't understand what the Gatling gun was. Not just in function, but in philosophy. It didn't track. It didn't curve. It didn't ask for permission or feedback or real-time recalibration. It just fired. Over and over. And it didn't stop until someone made it. Chkar appeared at the opposite gate, framed in sacred fog, wreathed in chorus. His eyes shimmered with polished malice. His armor flexed like breathing obsidian. The crowd roared. He didn't look at Ellie. He looked past her. Another Terran, he said, voice like falling granite. You die slower than we predicted. Ellie stepped forward. Not posturing. Just to set her boots at the right distance from her mount. I'm not here to die. He laughed. Then you are here to amuse. She spun the crank once. Just once. It purred. Chkar's smirk twitched. Not fear, curiosity. The gates rumbled. The lights surged. Maggie chimed one last time, like a bell that knew it was ringing for someone else. Ready. Ellie lowered herself behind the gun. Let's ruin their punchline. The battlefield bloomed into violence like a flower made of steel. The ground shifted beneath Ellie's boots, rising into staggered platforms and yawning chasms. Automated pylons cracked from the floor, hissing with atmospheric realignment. The sky pulsed a pale ultraviolet, an aesthetic choice to please the Moth People sponsors. Everything screamed spectacle. Everything, that is, except the Gatling gun, which hummed in its own ancient language, the groan of spun barrels, the mechanical heartbeat of pending violence. Commander Chkar didn't wait for the formality of the starting signal. He moved. Fast. Fluid. Unapologetically lethal. His limbs bent in 6 axes. His armor shimmered in microfractal patterns to disorient organic vision. He vaulted a pylon, slammed into the ground, and carved a gash in the terrain with a blade that wasn't quite metal, wasn't quite light. The crowd screamed approval. Ellie adjusted her footing. 1 half step. Her fingers twitched. The crank began to turn. The gun answered. Sound filled the arena. Not music. Not the elegant hum of plasma or the shriek of energy weapons. This was different. Guttural. Rotational. Ancient. The sound of a world that solved problems with metallurgy and motion. It didn't vibrate through circuits. It pounded through bone. The first volley tore across the field. Solid slugs, high velocity, tungsten cord. They hit with the weight of history. Chkar rolled under the opening burst, skimming along the stone with a grace more suited to liquid than bone. He came up snapping with a whip tendril and launched a swarm of needle shards that detonated on impact. Ellie ducked, rolled sideways. The shards nicked her shoulder. Sparks. Blood. Minor. The crank never stopped. She fired again. Adjusted. Fired again. Chkar twisted, his armor blooming open to vent heat and deflect mass. But not enough. A round caught his right pauldron and ricocheted into the joint beneath. His movement stuttered. Just a twitch. Most wouldn't have noticed. Ellie did. Minor destabilization, Maggie noted in her skull. Recommend exploiting. Already tracking. Chkar lunged. One blade extended, wide arc, full power. The strike aimed to bisect her entirely. Ellie dropped flat. The blade cut air. Wind screamed. She rotated the gun 30 degrees and released a tight, 6-round burst. One slug clipped his thigh plating, another cratered the floor near his stance. The third sank into the ground beneath him, triggering a seismic mine that hadn't been mapped. The explosion sent Chkar sideways. His trajectory corrupted. One limb curled in too slow. She cranked. A line of bullets chased his fall, tearing across stone and splintered metal. 3 found his side. Armor cracked. The living component inside hissed and retracted. The crowd began to change. Still noise. Still gasps and roars. But the tone shifted, laughter to uncertainty. Spectacle to scrutiny. The human wasn't dying. She was aiming. Chkar roared. His back-mounted systems flared. 6 drones launched from his shoulders, sweeping wide in a synchronized formation. They flanked Ellie instantly, sending out arcs of neural disruptors. Static swarmed her vision. Her legs trembled. The gun sagged by a fraction. Override in 3 seconds, Maggie warned. Can you hold? Ellie bit her cheek. Focused through the haze. Adjusted manually. The crank slowed. Then surged. The Gatling gun screamed. She twisted the barrel to a higher angle and swept across the drone formation. Bullets lanced through shield fields not built for sheer kinetic mass. 3 drones shattered like glass. The rest scattered. Her HUD cleared. The static receded. She stood straighter. The gun spun louder. Chkar advanced again, 2 limbs dragging. He was breathing now, choked, mechanical. His armor had begun to vent orange mist. Ellie didn't speak. She cranked. Bullets danced. Chkar charged directly through the fire. One arm braced against impact, the others swiping erratically. He reached her. Slammed her side. The force sent her skidding backward, ribs crunching, air ripped from her lungs. The crank stopped. Status, Maggie hissed. Cracked ribs. Left side. Gun intact. Chkar's nearing structural limit. I'm not interested in limits. She coughed blood. Rolled. Spun the crank. The gun answered like it had been waiting. Chkar bellowed and dove forward, launching a spike fist directly toward her skull. She ducked, twisted the tripod, and let the barrel roar. The bullets hit center mass. Too close, too many. The armor finally fractured. His body folded mid-lunge. He collapsed in a heap of noise and smoke. Silence fell. The Gatling gun whined to a stop. Brass casings clinked across the stone. Ellie stood still, the only motion in the entire arena. Her breathing shallow. Her hands blackened. Her left eye flickering with static. The gun hissed, hot and satisfied. Above, the audience failed to respond. They couldn't. A silence like old libraries settled. Chkar groaned. Ellie approached. He lay, not dead, but unraveling. His limbs spasmed. Armor dissolved. His voice was raw and trembling. What is that weapon? Ellie stared down at him. No AI. No target assist. No culture. Just metal. And me. He tried to laugh. It came out as a cough full of sparks. We were told, your species was broken. We are. She stepped past him. The announcers stammered. Official clarification pending, but, yes. Yes, it appears the human has won. A scattered noise rolled through the crowd. Not applause. Something else. Recognition. A dawning memory of history not studied, but survived. Maggie buzzed. Tactical feedback loop complete. Ellie didn't answer. She walked to the center of the field. A drone floated down, recording. She looked directly into the lens, raised one eyebrow, then turned and walked off the field, smoke curling from her barrel. Behind her, Chkara's symbiote let out a final death shriek, like a song sung backward into the dark. Ellie didn't flinch. The Gatling gun had spoken, and it did not repeat itself. The replay looped 17 times before anyone had the courage to say something. Not in the arena. No, that space had gone silent the instant Chkar collapsed in a clattering heap of compromised limbs and sparking armor. Not in the stands either, where emissaries, observers, and career diplomats stared at their own disbelief, unsure whether they just witnessed a historical anomaly or the slow-motion death of a galactic myth. The first noise came from a spectator 2 rows above the Fold's delegation, a puff-based species named Zelmer that reproduced through astonishment. The poor thing spontaneously butted a second head, gasped, and fainted into itself. One announcer said cautiously, did the Terran just win? Define win, replied the other, its voice flat with system shock. And then set that definition on fire. Above the field, the scoreboard flickered once, uncertain how to classify a victory involving hand-cranked munitions. Eventually, it updated with 3 words in bold, universal standard. Match. Completed. Winner. Ellie Mira Trask. The feed broadcast to 93.4% of the known galaxy. Several million viewers suffered immediate cognitive buffering errors. One financial algorithm interpreted the update as a hostile takeover and liquidated the accounts of 3 warlords. Back in the council chamber, a fog of bureaucratic dread began to settle. High Commander Tilvek of the Obsidian Fold stared at the replay with his clawed hands steepled beneath his throat. His skin had turned a shade that, in his species, indicated both fury and gastrointestinal malfunction. He did not speak. He simply pressed one button on his control pad, tactical alert, and then another, contain media. Too late. The footage was already viral. On GNet Alpha, a headline screamed, "The Cranked Human. How one Earthling rewrote warfare with a museum piece." On the Terra networks, celebratory memes flooded the feed. Old Earth propaganda posters resurrected, now with Ellie's expressionless face front and center, above captions like, "Spin, till they listen," and "Recoil diplomacy, make it count." A new trend began immediately. Terran youth recording themselves trying to crankwalk in her honor. Injuries followed. Meanwhile, Ellie Mira Trask walked alone down the maintenance corridor beneath the arena, dragging the smoking remains of her tripod behind her. The gun had cooled but not quieted, its metal still ticking with thermal fatigue and historical satisfaction. Maggie buzzed in her head. You realize what you've done? Yes. You're trending in 6 hostile territories. Figures. They're calling it Gatling diplomacy. That's not the worst label we've had. Outside, the Spiral Pits event administrators were in freefall. A diplomatic liaison from the Paxic Dominion filed an emergency injunction to have Ellie disqualified on the grounds that her weapon lacked ethical sophistication. Another demanded the match be nullified because her firearm had no embedded compassion module. The council held an emergency vote. 2 delegates abstained. 1 wept. One tried to Google what a Gatling gun was and found a 21st century YouTube reenactment titled, "Gat Crank Go BRR." Ellie emerged from the corridor into the docking bay where her ship, a low-grade hauler with the charm of a dented toolbox, waited in silent solidarity. A flight technician approached, eyes wide, mouth slightly ajar. "You're, cleared for departure." "Didn't ask," Ellie said, stepping past him. But you just killed. I disabled a war puppet. She climbed the ramp. The technician blinked. What was that thing you used? Ellie paused at the threshold. It's called a Gatling gun. The tech squinted. Is that like plasma? No. Neural linked. No. Guided. She tilted her head. It spins. It shoots. It stops problems. The ramp sealed behind her with a pneumatic hiss. Inside the cockpit, the lights glowed a dull amber. The engines coughed awake. Ellie collapsed into the pilot's seat with a groan and reached for the control toggles, each one labeled with a combination of grease and spite. A screen blinked to life. Incoming message. From UHC Diplomatic Corps. Subject: Urgent debrief plus medal consideration plus please come home. She ignored it. Another alert flashed. From Obsidian Fold. Retaliation status. Undetermined. Ellie deleted that one. Maggie pulsed softly in her skull. You know you'll be on every blacklist now. I was already on 3. This time you didn't just survive. You embarrassed them. Publicly. Ellie exhaled. Not my fault they brought politics to a bullet fight. The ship rose. Below her, the arena still flickered with the afterimage of a match that should have gone differently. War analysts would spend years parsing her firing angles, her timing, the lack of drones, the absence of AI oversight. Some would claim it had been rigged. Others would build cults. The truth was simpler. They hadn't expected to be hurt by something so old, so blunt, so defiantly human. Across the galactic networks, reactions multiplied. In the Fold's core systems, military academies began quietly re-evaluating their kinetic countermeasures. In the Zurian synthesis rings, where data was considered religion, an archived article titled Humanity's Last Wars, a primer on projectile obsolescence, was deleted overnight. In Terran space, coffee mugs were printed with her silhouette and the words, "She cranked it back." The cultural tremor had started, and it would not stop soon. Hours later, on a quiet trade moon in the Velis cluster, 2 soldiers from rival factions watched the match on loop from a seedy bar. One, a 6-eyed reptilian named Karen, drained his drink and muttered, "Maybe they're not obsolete after all." The other, a tired insectoid with too many metals and not enough limbs, replied, "No. They're just patient." And elsewhere, in an undisclosed orbital bunker deep beneath Council record storage, a historian looked up from the dusty archives of ancient Earth weaponry. She opened a sealed file marked Terran Kinetic Weapons, Decommissioned. She stared at the entries. Browning, M61 Vulcan, DSHK, GAU 8 Avenger. She added one more. Gatling, Model Unknown. Under category, she typed, Required Study. Under threat rating, Unreliable. Until used. Ellie's ship disappeared into the drift stream, silent and unread. Maggie gave one last hum. They'll come after you. They always do. Want a plan? No, Ellie said, eyes closed, body easing into the hum of the stars. I want them to keep underestimating me. Far behind her, the ruins of certainty still smoldered. And across the galaxy, weapon systems that had never heard the crank of analog defiance now feared its rhythm. Because it turned out the gun didn't need smart bullets or nanite swarms. It just needed someone to spin it like they meant it.